HighBridge, a division of recorded books, presents The Great Shift, Encountering God in Biblical Times, by James Kugel, read by Malcolm Hillgartner. Timeline of major figures and events. Israel's remote ancestors: Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and his wives. Dates uncertain. Moses and the Exodus, 13th to 12th centuries BCE. Footnote: BCE stands for before the Common Era, that is, BC. End footnote. Joshua and the entrance into Canaan, Deborah, Samson, and the other judges, 13th to 11th centuries BCE. First Temple period, circa 1000 to 586 BCE. Saul becomes king of Israel, late 11th century BCE. King David, founder of the United Monarchy, ruled circa 1010 to circa 970 BCE. King Solomon, ruled United Monarchy circa 970 to circa 930 BCE. King Rehoboam succeeds Solomon, breakup of the United Monarchy, late 10th century BCE. Separate kingdoms of Judah in the south and Israel in the north. The prophets Elijah and Elisha, 9th century BCE. The prophet Amos, early to mid-8th century BCE. Hosea, Isaiah, and Micah prophecy. Assyria threatening. Latter half of 8th century BCE. Fall of Israel, northern kingdom, to Assyria, 722 to 721 BCE. Henceforth, Bible's focus is on Judah, southern kingdom. Josiah becomes king of Judah, 641 to 640 BCE. Jeremiah begins prophesying, 627 to 626 BCE. King Josiah dies. Neo-Babylonian Empire begins actively threatening, 609 BCE. Babylonians deport King Jehoiakim and many prominent Jerusalemites, including the prophet Ezekiel, to Babylon, 597 BCE. Fall of Jerusalem to Babylonians, mass deportation of Judeans to Babylon, Jeremiah and Ezekiel, major prophets, 587 to 586 BCE. Babylonian exile and aftermath. After Cyrus's Persian Empire takes over Babylon, exiled Judeans begin to return to their homeland. Late 6th century BCE. Second Temple period, circa 530 BCE to 70 CE. Persians rule province of Judah until decisive Battle of Issus, when Alexander the Great conquers entire region, 333 BCE. Judea ruled by Egyptian Ptolemies, from 323 BCE. First Enoch, Book of Jubilees, late 3rd, early 2nd century BCE. Syrian Seleucids take over Judea from Ptolemies, 198 BCE. Book of Ben Sira written, circa 180 BCE. Revolt of the Maccabees ousts Seleucids, leading to Jewish self-rule, 166 to 63 BCE. Origins of Dead Sea Scrolls community, second half of 2nd century BCE. Pompey conquers Jerusalem to start Roman rule, 63 BCE. Jewish revolt against Romans ends in defeat, 66 to 70 CE. Forward. I have spent most of my adult life researching and teaching the Hebrew Bible. For more than 20 years I taught at Yale and Harvard universities, and another 10 years at Bar Ilan University in Israel. It has been a real pleasure teaching the students in these places, but I've never lost sight of my main purpose in going into this field. I wanted, as much as possible, to get inside the biblical world and see what ancient Israelites saw, to enter their minds in order to understand what the Bible is really saying. Over the years I've written books on various topics, But I've saved for this last one what seems to me the most important question of all. Modern scholars know that in biblical times, people did not believe in God the way they do now. In truth, there is not a single verse in the Hebrew Bible that suggests that God's existence was a matter of belief or faith, and it certainly was not the subject of debate or questioning. True, biblical figures are sometimes said to believe in God in the sense that they put their trust or faith in God's readiness to intervene on their behalf, believing that He will help them. But it was not God's existence that was believed in. That was simply obvious. Sometimes it is asserted that people back then simply assumed that God exists because they lacked today's knowledge of science, and so had to conclude that some sort of divine being was in charge of life on earth. But if biblical stories are any kind of guide, people in ancient times sometimes encountered God, or at least thought they did. Moreover, the whole way in which these encounters took place seems quite foreign to the experience of most of us today. My aim in the present study is to try to understand why this is so. The question I wish to answer, using all that we now know about biblical Israel and its neighbors, is, what was the actual lived reality of God in biblical times, and why have most people lost it today? A word of caution to begin with. This book is not for everyone. Many of the things that modern scholars have discovered about the Bible go against the established religious doctrines of Judaism and Christianity. This can be quite disturbing for some readers. Even among university researchers, there are those who try to put their own spin on recent discoveries, consciously or otherwise, seeking to salvage what they can of traditional teachings. On the other extreme, there are certainly some contemporary scholars who see their mission as debunking everything people used to believe about the Bible. My own program here is to avoid either approach. What I wish to do is to make use of everything modern scholars have discovered about the Bible and the ancient Near East, as well as a few other topics, and to try to use these insights, along with a little imagination, in order to enter the world of the Bible as fully and truly as possible, to see things as they were seen then. To do this, however, is to pursue a moving target, because even within the biblical period, roughly 1,000 years long, things changed. If you go back far enough in biblical history, you find yourself in a very different world. How can someone make sense, realistic sense, of the things that people say and do in the Bible? One of the most common features in the writings of ancient Israel's prophets and sages is the assertion that God speaks, indeed, speaks to them. The word of the Lord came to me, saying, Thus says the Lord, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying. What did they mean by this? Did a voice just pop into their heads? God does not seem to speak in this way to people today. True, some people seek divine guidance or advice in prayer or meditation, and an answer sometimes emerges in their minds. But this is rather different from divine speech in the Bible, where the people involved are not usually seeking to hear from God. Often, in fact, they flee at the very prospect. When God addresses Moses out of the burning bush, Moses hid his face, because he was afraid to look at God. He tries to turn down the mission that God has reserved for him. Please, he begs, send someone else. Later, when God reveals himself to the Israelites assembled at Mount Sinai, all the people saw it and fell back and stood at a distance. You be the one to speak to us, they said to Moses, and we will obey. But do not let God speak to us, lest we die. Exodus chapter 20, verses 15 through 16. Some Bibles, chapter 20, verses 18 through 19. Prophets summoned by God similarly react by saying, Please, find someone else. This is basically what Jeremiah says when God first calls him, and other prophets are likewise reluctant. In fact, the prophet Jonah didn't say anything. When God called him, he hopped the next ship to faraway Tarshish, hoping God would simply forget about him. Moreover, what God has to say to these prophets, as well to virtually all others, does not come in response to some request from the human beings involved. He simply speaks to people unprompted, demanding that they do something or announce things to come. Footnote. Throughout this book I have referred to God using the pronouns he, him, his, etc., since for the most part God was represented as a specifically male deity in biblical times. By the same token, the capital letter H is intended to convey the respect for the various forms of divine reference current in the Hebrew Bible itself. End footnote. Amos describes transmitting God's message as a kind of knee-jerk reaction. If a lion roars, who isn't afraid? And if God speaks, who doesn't prophesy? What could have been the lived reality behind such assertions? In fact, it is not just a matter of divine speech. Many biblical texts report that God actually appeared to people. Some modern theologians have sought to downplay these passages, since most people nowadays hold that God has no physical form, nothing that the eye can perceive. But that does not appear to have been the case with Abraham or Sarah or Jacob or Moses or Isaiah. All these, along with numerous other biblical figures, are said to have actually seen God, once or even several times. The Lord appeared to him by the oak trees of Mamre, the book of Genesis reports matter-of-factly about Abraham. Jacob tells his son Joseph, God Almighty appeared to me at Luz, in the land of Canaan, and he blessed me. I saw the Lord standing next to the altar, Amos recounts. Woe is me, I am lost, says Isaiah, for my own eyes have beheld the King, the Lord of hosts. In the 30th year, on the 5th day of the 4th month, the heavens opened, and I saw the appearance of God, Ezekiel says. Were they all lying? It seems to me more likely that these people, or more precisely the people telling their stories, must have felt that they were telling the truth, at least in some sense. It was altogether plausible for a person to hear and see God in a way that is quite distant from us today. But to say this is virtually to admit that human beings today seem to have lost this vital capacity. Of course, one might just say, ancient people had a different understanding of reality, and leave it at that. But this doesn't really answer the question. Why do these biblical texts say what they say? And if there was any reality to them, why has it mostly disappeared? Finding an answer is no simple undertaking. It involves getting into the nitty-gritty of modern biblical scholarship and its investigation of various biblical narratives and prophecies, the songs and psalms of the Bible, its laws and its proverbs, as well as borrowing some insights from neuroscience and anthropology. Before we are done, we will have looked at much of the Hebrew Bible, because almost all of it has something to tell us about the great subject at the core of this book, the reality of God in ancient times, and in our own. A few technicalities before we begin. Most of the translations of biblical texts are my own, but I have drawn here and there on two excellent modern translations, the New Jewish Publication Society, NJPS, and the New Revised Standard Version, NRSV, translations. For proper names from the Bible, I have generally used the standard English forms rather than transcriptions of the Hebrew, thus Jacob and not Yaakov, Jerusalem and not Yerushalayim. In transcribing Hebrew words, I have used the rough English equivalents rather than scientific transcription, thus Le David rather than Le David. The only exception is that cleaning your glasses sound represented by the letter H with an underdot, as distinct from our ordinary H sound. The numbering of biblical verses poses a great problem, particularly in the book of Psalms. A surprising variety in the numbering of Psalms verses exists. Many modern translations do not include the various psalm headings in their numbering, so that a one-verse difference exists between such numberings and the traditional numbering of the Hebrew text. A similar gap appears here and there in other biblical books as well. After some deliberation, I have decided to list the traditional Hebrew numbering alone in cases where there is only a one-verse difference, trusting that curious readers will easily be able to find the verse in question adjacent to the one listed in their own translations. In cases of more than a one-verse difference, I have listed the Hebrew numbering first, followed by some Bibles such and such. Part 1. 1,000 ages in thy sight. The Bible consists of texts composed at different times, by most accounts, over the course of nearly 1,000 years. Within this period, people are sometimes said to meet God face to face. At other times, God seems to be more remote and abstract. Sometimes people don't actually encounter God at all. Which picture is the right one? 1. Seeing biblically.
Encounters with angels. Hidden behind the curtain. Waking dreams. A different kind of mind.
The Bible sometimes seems to stress that when people encountered God, either directly or in the form of an angel, they saw in a special way, quite different from ordinary seeing. And yet what they saw was usually just another ordinary human being or some object from daily life. In the book of Genesis, Hagar is the maidservant of Abraham's wife, Sarah. At a certain point, she and Sarah have a falling out, and Sarah orders her to be banished, in fact, sent off into the bleak wilderness along with her young son Ishmael. This cruel decree is carried out, and poor Hagar wanders about with her son for a time. Eventually they run out of drinking water, and it seems they will both die of thirst. Hagar, despairing, leaves her son under one of the nearby bushes and sits down some distance away. "I don't want to have to watch the boy die," she says, and bursts into tears. But help is on the way. God heard the boy's cry, and an angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What is the matter, Hagar? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy's cry from where he is. Get up, pick up the boy, and hold him tight in your arms, for I intend him to become a great nation." And God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. So she went and filled the water skin with water, and gave the boy to drink. Genesis chapter 21, verses 17 through 19. This is one of those passages that biblical scholars call a name etiology. Ishmael's name means God hears, or may God hear. So the passage suggests, not once but twice, that Ishmael was so named because God heard Ishmael's cry. Beyond this, there is a larger national issue lurking beneath the narrative. Ishmael's descendants would indeed become a great nation, as later history was to show. This section of Genesis thus seeks to point out that, on the one hand, those Ishmaelites are actually the Israelites' cousins, both peoples descended from Abraham. But on the other hand, it was equally important to assert that they were Israel's inferiors, the descendants of a mere maidservant who had been unceremoniously booted out of Abraham's camp. 2 kinds of seeing. For our subject, however, what is most important is the beginning of the last sentence. God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. Why should the narrative have said that God opened her eyes? Minutes earlier she seemed to be wandering around in the wasteland with nothing to drink. Now an angel calls to Hagar from heaven and tells her that everything will be all right and that, in fact, God has destined her son for greatness. Then God himself opens her eyes, and she suddenly sees a well that will save her life along with that of her son. Why didn't she see it before? Nothing in the text implies that she then had to dig the well, or that God led her to some previously hidden opening in the ground. Apparently the well was in plain sight all along. In fact, the text had earlier mentioned that Hagar put her son under one of the bushes because she couldn't stand to witness his death. But didn't she know that bushes, especially bushes in the scorched wilderness, must have some source of water to survive, and that such a source must therefore be somewhere very close by? If so, why did God have to open her eyes? And, by the way, were they really closed? The answer to all these questions has to do with the act of seeing itself. In numerous places in the Bible, the text seems to go out of its way to assert that there is a special kind of seeing associated with divine encounters. It is as if the normal faculty of sight is shut down, replaced by something else. At first, people think that their eyes are perceiving things, but this is just an optical illusion. That is why, in a divine vision, people often seem to be in some kind of fog, as Hagar apparently is here. The most obvious things seem to escape their attention. After a while, however, they catch on. Suddenly they realize that this is a divine encounter, that their eyes are really not functioning normally, and what they think they are seeing, they are not seeing at all. That is why God has to open Hagar's eyes afterwards. He has to switch her vision from the special to the regular sort of seeing in order for her to perceive what was right in front of her all along. Footnote. A similar switch back to regular sight is specially marked in Genesis chapter 22, verse 13. And Abraham lifted up his eyes, and he saw, and behold, a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. This was a real ram, the one that Abraham goes on to sacrifice. But before that, apparently, his eyes were working in the vision mode. It is noteworthy, however, that the specially marked act of seeing usually introduces the vision rather than following it. See below. End footnote. This special kind of seeing is often marked as such in the Bible. One day, sitting outside his tent, Abraham sees 3 men approaching. Notice, however, the Bible's wording. Now the Lord appeared to him by the terebinths of Mamre, while he was sitting at the door of his tent in the heat of the day. And he lifted up his eyes, and he saw, and behold, 3 men were standing near him, and he saw. And he ran from the tent door toward them, and bowed down low. Genesis chapter 18, verses 1 through 2. The first sentence describes to the reader what really happened. The Lord appeared to Abraham. But that isn't what Abraham saw, so the text stresses the fact that he was seeing in a different mode. He lifted up his eyes, and he saw, and behold, and he saw. This vision carries on for a while. Abraham prepares an elaborate meal for his 3 guests, then watches them eat, or at least thinks that that is what he is seeing. But every ancient Israelite knew that angels cannot eat. "Where is your wife Sarah?" they ask. But how do these strangers know his wife's name? The whole thing is like a dream, except that Abraham seems to be wide awake. Then he said, "I will return in a year's time, and your wife Sarah will have a son." Sarah had been listening at the door of the tent which was in back of him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, well advanced in years. Sarah had stopped having the periods that women have. So Sarah laughed to herself. "After I am all worn out, will I still have relations, not to mention that my husband is old too?" Then the Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Can I really give birth, old as I am?' Is anything too much for the Lord? In a year's time I will be back, and Sarah will have a son." Genesis chapter 18, verses 10 through 14. It is important to pay close attention to the words. This whole section is being told to us from the point of view of the narrative. The text is saying that this is really God speaking to Abraham. But Abraham and Sarah don't know this. They are still in a fog, as they will be until the end. Beyond this specific observation, what is remarkable about the whole incident is what it seems to be saying about human encounters with God. They do take place. A person could just be sitting in front of his tent on a hot afternoon, and suddenly God might appear to him. But the person could never really be sure of what he was seeing, because his eyes seemed to be telling him that this was just an ordinary human being. One might say this was his brain's way of representing to itself something that was not visual at all. Then God begins to speak, and in the present example, even though Abraham doesn't know it is God speaking, the words enter his mind. "I will return to you in a year's time, and Sarah will have a son." Verse 14. The words turn out to be true. Sarah does indeed give birth to Isaac. But the accompanying visual part, the things that Abraham's eyes have been seeing, remain a kind of waking dream. Even after those true words coming from God had been spoken, the waking dream can continue, as it does in this case. The passage thus ends, "Then the men set out from there and looked down toward Sodom, and Abraham went along with them to see them off. He's still in a fog. A much briefer but similar case is the appearance of an angel to Moses. Tending his father-in-law's flocks, Moses arrives in Horeb, the site of the mountain of God, or the gods. Footnote. The Hebrew word Elohim can mean either God or the gods. End footnote. Again, it is important to notice the wording. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flaming fire from the midst of the bush. And he saw, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, but the bush was not burnt up. Moses said, I have to take a closer look at this sight. Why isn't that bush burning up? Once the Lord saw that he had come to take a look, God called to him from the middle of the bush, Moses, Moses! He answered, Here I am. Exodus chapter 3, verses 2 through 4. What is the text seeking to say? To us, the readers, listeners, it is saying that God appeared to Moses. But this is not what Moses saw. All he saw was a bush that somehow kept burning and burning, so much so that he was eventually persuaded to go off the beaten path to take a closer look. Was it a real bush? Real bushes don't keep burning like that. But once this vision had drawn Moses close enough to where God was, God could begin to speak to him, and the visual part could disappear. Footnote. Through most of the biblical period, there was no reason not to believe that God did not have some sort of physical form, and in this account, that physical form was in a specific place, on or near the mountain of God, the gods. End footnote. Thus, when the text describes what Moses saw in this narrative, the thing that he calls this sight, it is speaking strictly from Moses' point of view, and talking about that other kind of seeing. As with Abraham, one might say that this was the brain's way of processing a non-visual encounter in visual terms. Later, however, Moses hears God's voice, and the angel disappears. Now Moses is out of the visionary mode of seeing. Actually, he sees nothing. All he is doing is listening to God speak. Why was this plausible? By this I do not mean to ask if Moses or Abraham really had such an encounter. There is no way to know that, or even to know if such a person as Moses or Abraham ever really existed. Rather, my question is, what did the first audience of these stories assume about God and about seeing that made these accounts seem plausible and even realistic? If one considers as a whole the Bible's various narrations of people's encounters with the divine, a definite pattern emerges, not in every case to be sure, but in quite a few. The people involved suddenly meet up with God, but this is not normal seeing. Indeed, the text sometimes enters into a kind of double narration, telling us that this was God, while at the same time seeking to duplicate what the person involved saw, 3 men, or a bush that kept burning. At the same time, the narrative makes sure we know that the people are in a kind of fog. What they think they see, often referred to as an angel, is not what they are really seeing, but the brain's way of processing this encounter. Eventually, however, God starts to speak to them. At this point, they may or may not realize that what they had been seeing was a vision, but in any case, what they hear is the voice of God. So this is the pattern in many biblical narratives. What they see is an illusion, but what God says is real. The question is, why? A few further examples may clarify the point. The moment of confusion. Gideon ended up as a chieftain of the Israelites, one of the judges. The word shofet really means leader in early Hebrew, in the book of Judges. His rise to leadership began at a low point in his tribe's fortunes. The marauding Midianites kept attacking his kinsmen to seize their grain. In fact, the story opens with Gideon beating out grains of wheat in the winepress to keep them safe from the Midianites. But then the angel of the Lord appeared to him and said, "The Lord is with you, O mighty warrior." Gideon said to him, "Excuse me, sir, but if the Lord is with us, why are we having all this trouble? Where are all the miracles that our ancestors recorded for us, saying, 'Truly the Lord took us up out of Egypt, but now the Lord has abandoned us, and—'"
Sample complete. Ready to continue?